Alright, so this course is about Visual Studio Code. This is one of the most powerful IDEs that we have for Salesforce development. So let's deep dive in. Now, as a developer, it's important to have the best tools to get your job done, right? So in this course, we'll discuss how to set up Visual Studio Code, configure the Salesforce CLI, which is used to connect Salesforce with VSCode, connect our VSCode with source control like Git, and see how we can leverage this tool to excel at Salesforce development. Now, before we begin with Visual Studio Code, let's talk about what is an IDE. Now, an IDE, or an integrated development environment, typically consists of a code editor that lets you write some code, some build automation tools that lets you automate or configure things, a debugger that lets you console log and check whether your logic is working as expected or not, and an intelligent code completion that lets you complete code intelligently. Visual Studio Code as an IDE provides all of these capabilities. The next thing we need to discuss or know about is Salesforce CLI. Now, Salesforce CLI is nothing but the command line tool for Salesforce development. The Salesforce CLI is the command line interface tool that makes development on the Salesforce platform easy and convenient. One can integrate the Salesforce CLI tool with Visual Studio Code and start Salesforce development instantly. Next, we arrive at the point wherein we need to install these tools. So let's look at the installation guidelines for Visual Studio Code and SFDX CLI, or rather Salesforce CLI. So the first and foremost thing that we need to do is install Visual Studio Code from this link right here, which is code.visualstudio.com. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll just open this link right here that opens up on the browser, and this lets us download either the Mac version or the Windows version or the Linux version. So whichever operating system you are on, you can just click on the download button and you should be able to download the latest stable version for VS Code. So now, as you can see, the VS Code Darwin Universal zip file is getting downloaded in my local machine right now. Now, once this is completely downloaded, we'll unzip this particular folder and extract the VS Code zip, and we'll try to install VS Code in our machines. So if I just extract my VS Code folder right here, you should see that the Visual Studio Code has been downloaded here. And I see that here on my taskbar as well. So the same is applicable for people using Windows and Linux machines. So now let's do something. Let's click on the Visual Studio Code icon and let's try to launch it. So the very first time that you launch Visual Studio Code, this is the welcome screen that you're greeted with initially. Now this gives you some walkthrough options where you can take a look at how to get started with VS Code, learn some fundamentals and all of that. You can take a look at your recent repositories if you have already been here, or you can just use the shortcuts to create a new file, open a particular folder, or run a command, right? So before we head on to this, let's take a look back at our keynote and see what's the next thing that we need to do. So the next thing is we need to make Visual Studio Code Salesforce ready. And to do the same, we need to install our SFDX CLI, which is from this link right here. So if I click on this link, this takes me to the SFDX CLI download screen. And just like how we had options for VS Code, we have the similar options for Salesforce CLI. And this is your command line interface for all your SFDX features. So what I can do is I can just select the Mac OS feature and click on download for Mac OS. And this initiates another download, which would be for the Salesforce CLI. If you take a look here, the Salesforce CLI is the powerful command line interface that simplifies development and automation while working on your Salesforce org. So you can create and manage orgs, you can import and export data as well as metadata, you can create and execute tests, you can do some debugging, you can synchronize data from source orgs or scratch orgs, and you can create and install packages. So all of it can be done just by this single tool, that's Salesforce CLI. Now once this is also installed, you should start seeing SFDX in your machine. Now to certify that, what I'll do is I'll just open the command line terminal here. The VS Code terminal, and I can simply type in SFDX. Now if you see, when I type SFDX, I see that there's an update available for SFDX CLI from this particular version to this version right here. And since this loads up my SFDX commands, which means SFDX has been successfully installed. If you see that the SFDX version is 7.114 for Darwin x64 with this node version, right? And if I were to check what version am I currently running on, I can just simply check SFDX space -- version. So this would give me my current version this right here, and it also gives me a warning prompt that says that you can update your SFDX. So ideally, if you install the SFDX CLI for the very first time, you'll have the latest update with you. But if any time you have older version, you can simply type in the command SFDX space update to update your current SFDX CLI. And if you see, the same command is running now and it's installing the latest Salesforce CLI, this right here. Now while this happens, let me take you back to the keynote and let's see what's the next step. So once Salesforce CLI is installed in your machine, you can confirm the installation using the command prompt. Always ensure you are on the latest version of SFDX. So this ensures that you don't run out of any SFDX related issues or CLI related issues on VS Code. Sometimes that happens. The next and final step that we need to procure or we need to do is we need to install an extension on our VS Code, and that's called the Salesforce extension pack. Now once this extension is installed, we need to relaunch our Visual Studio Code and you are all set to start development. So let's take a look at the extensions folder. So if you see right here, I'll just brief you about the VS Code overview here. So what we have open right here is the terminal. We have other tabs that's called problems, output, or the debug console. We are currently on the terminal, and you can use this plus icon to create multiple terminals that can run parallelly. Right, this section is your main screen right here, wherein you see the welcome icon, welcome page. You can open files here and you can write your code right here. So we can get rid of this section right here. Now on the extreme left hand side, we have the explorer that lets you open a particular folder. We have the search option that lets you globally search. We have the option that's source control. If you have your VS Code connected with Git or any other source control tool, maybe a short DevOps or something else, you can open or sync your repositories here. The fourth option is for running and debugging. This is solely for debug logs. The fifth option right here is the extensions, and if you see, there are a lot of extensions available and I have some of them downloaded as well. So as per the fourth step, what we need to do is we need to simply type in Salesforce extension pack and install this particular extension. And if you see, this is already installed in my machine. And what does this include? This includes all these extensions: Apex Replay Debugger, Lightning Aura Components, CLI integration, and so on and so forth for Sockle, Lightning Web Components. So all of these features come in as a single package through the Salesforce extension pack. Right? Once you install this, you can just relaunch your VS Code and your Salesforce extension pack will be ready along with your VS Code, and you can immediately start developing on Salesforce. Right? So the first thing you could check once your Salesforce extension pack has been installed is you can use Command Shift P or you can use Control Shift P on a Windows machine and simply type SFDX, and you should start seeing some commands coming up there. So if you see, I have something that's called SFDX create project with manifest, SFDX create project. So as soon as you start seeing SFDX commands coming up here for you, which means your setup is completely ready and you're ready to work with Salesforce using Visual Studio Code. Right? Okay. Alright, so now that we have Visual Studio Code set up and it is Salesforce ready to create projects and do local development, let's first of all start with creating a project. Right? So let's look at project creation in VS Code. So the shortcut to access SFDX commands is Command Shift P, or it is Control Shift P on a Windows machine. And if you see, if I start typing SFDX, I see some commands coming up right here. Right? And if you simply type create project, you should also see some options coming up here. So we'll go ahead and create a project with manifest. This will create a package.xml for us, which we'll look into a bit later, but this will create a local project repository folder with all the relevant information and metadata in it. So I'll just click on create project with manifest, and this asks me what kind of template do you want. So we'll just go with the standard template, which is the default template that VS Code provides. It asks for a project name. Now here I'll just give it a random name. I'll call it my first VS Code project, and I'll say enter. Now when I do that, it asks me where do I want to store my project. So let me go ahead and do that on my desktop. I'll just create a new folder and I'll say practice repositories, and this is the folder I choose, and I'll say create project. Now when I do that, initially there are some permissions that Visual Studio Code will want to access. I'll just say okay, and I'll say yes, I trust the authors. Now when I do that, my project, if you see here, has been successfully created. Now if I were to go to my desktop, I should see something that's called practice repositories, and inside which I would have my Salesforce project. So this is my first Salesforce project that I've created from VS Code, right? This right now would be pretty much an empty folder. If you take a look at the Force app main default section, I would see all my metadata folders are here, but they would be pretty much empty because there's no metadata available for any org or any kind of source control, right? So this is the standard template default package that VS Code creates when we use the SFDX command to create project with manifest. Now when we say with manifest, this folder right here is what it is meant about. And if you see, there's something that's called package.xml, which we'll take a look at in a while, right? So now that we have an empty folder, this is our project and it has been created successfully in our local repositories. Now next, let's take a look at authorizing a Salesforce org, right? Now authorizing a Salesforce org means we have something down here that's called no default org set. So now we need to associate a particular Salesforce org with our VS Code. And to do that, we need to set a default org, right? Or rather, we need to authorize an org so that we are able to deploy and retrieve some metadata to and from our VS Code, right? So to do that, now that I have my Visual Studio project for Salesforce ready, if I say Command Shift P and say SFDX, I see a lot many options coming up, not just the create project options, right? I have a lot many options. So if you see, I can create an Apex class, I can create a project again, I can authorize an org, right? This is the option that we are looking for. So if I just say authorize, there's something that's called authorize an org, right? I can also do the same by clicking down here on the no default org set. So what I can do is I can set a default org with my VS Code. This particular configuration can have a default org. So when I click here, I get an option to either authorize an org, authorize a dev hub, create a default scratch org, or other options, right? I have some options created here, which is why they're coming down below. But what I want to do is I want to authorize a normal org, right? So what I'll do is I'll say SFDX authorize an org. It asks me what kind of URL does your org belong to. So it could be a production URL, it could be a sandbox. You might want to use the custom domain URL, or you could have a default login.salesforce.com URL that is defined on the SFDX project JSON file right here. Okay, I'll go ahead and say production, I'll say login.salesforce.com. Now when you do that, it asks for a default alias, any kind of alias that you want to put. So I'll say first org connection and I'll say enter. Now as soon as I do that, so this comes up here with a pop-up and asks me for the username and password, which is the credentials for my org. Now let me go ahead and authorize my org. So let's click on login. So when I say login, my org is successfully logged into in my default browser, and when it is successfully logged in here, you should see that the VS Code also shows a prompt that will say that the authorization has been successful. So you see the authorization is successful, and now I have my personal org set up here. Now the alias is personal org and it's also first org connection if you see. Now this is because I have already connected my org with my VS Code, which is why it is preserving the previous alias, but this is the alias that I recently created. So you can see all the alias coming up here. Now if you have multiple orgs, you can switch between them just by clicking on your alias names. All right, and if you want to authorize a new org again, you can use the authorize option that comes up right on top. All right, so now once your org is authorized, you can start writing code and you can deploy it to your org, or you can fetch or retrieve any kind of metadata from your org to your local VS Code repository. Now before we start deploying and retrieving metadata, let's understand package.xml. Right? So when we created our project, it said that the create project with manifest, right? Now this manifest contains a XML file that's called the package.xml. This contains nothing but all the metadata identifiers that you want to deploy or retrieve your metadata to or from your org. So if you see, there are some specific keywords for specific kind of metadata, right? There's Apex class, there's Apex component, there could be Aura components, there could be Lightning component bundle, and so on and so forth. These members are nothing but all the members under this particular type. So when we say star, we mean all the Apex triggers. When we say star, we mean all the test suites, right? Now if I right click here, you'll see that I can do something that's called retrieve source in manifest from org, which means I am trying to say VS Code that fetch me everything that's present in the org that is from this particular manifest file. So all the static resources, all the lightning component bundles, all the apex pages, all the components, all the apex classes, everything will come to my local repository from the org. Which org would that be? This particular org right here, my personal org, my first org connection, this right here, right? So if I want to do that, I can just say right click and I say retrieve source in manifest from org. Or else, if let's say I've done some kind of changes here, which we'll see in a while, and if I want to deploy those changes from my VS Code to my org, I can just say right click and deploy source in manifest to org. So you see the keyword to and from here, that's what it means. Okay, so for any kind of bulk metadata retrieval or deployment you want to do to and from your org, you can use package.xml. This package.xml can also be maintained and can also be used to create packages, and can also be used to do deployments from sandbox to sandbox or sandbox to production. All right, this particular package.xml can be customized. This is the basic standard package.xml that we receive from Salesforce when we create, from SFDX CLI when we create a folder, but this can be customized. You can add many more metadata, many more identifiers. You can remove any of them. You can specify particular members instead of using all the members in that particular list. So all of that can be configured based on your project or your business requirements. Now that we've understood package.xml, let's try to deploy some metadata to our org, right? So before deploying it, let's do something. Let's open our developer console right here, and let's just keep that open. Now, while the developer console opens up there, what I'll do here is I'll just try to create something here in my VS Code repository. So let's say our requirement is to create a new Apex class, right? So what I can do is I can just say again Command Shift P or Control Shift P, and I can just write Apex. So it's keyword driven and it's intelligent code completion, not code completion here, but command completion here. So you can just say create Apex class from this particular section right here. Or what you could also do is go to the classes section, right click, and you could say SFDX create Apex class here. So you have both options present, right? So let me just click on create Apex class. This prompts me to enter a file name. I'll call it my first Apex, and it asks me for a default directory which says force app main default classes, which means this folder right here, which is correct. So I'll just select this particular directory, and this creates my first Apex class along with the meta file right here. With the API version and the status, I see that my Apex class is created, public, with sharing my first Apex with the constructor, right? So let me do something. Let me just create a method right here. And I'll just put up a debug log. All right, I'll just save my Apex class here. So now if you see that my classes folder has a Apex class that's present here, but do you think this file will be present on my org? It won't be, right? Because you would have to deploy this file from your local repository to your org. So to do that, you can just simply click on right click, and you can just say deploy this source to org. Okay, so to deploy anything from your current source to a repo or any destination, you can use the deploy command, and to fetch any kind of information, you can say retrieve. Make sense? All right, so now when you say deploy this source to org, what this will do is this will internally run a deployment and deploy this particular Apex class to your Salesforce org. So to check beforehand, let's copy this my first Apex class, and let's just go here and say Command Shift O, and let's search for our Apex class and see if it is present there. So I don't see any Apex class with this name. Right now, let's do something. Let's go back to VS Code and just say deploy. So it runs a deploy source to org command through the SFDX CLI, and once this is successful, we should see a success message coming up here. So you see, deploy source to org has successfully ran, and if you see the output, these two files have been successfully created in your org. Right now that we go to our developer console and search for our file, we might have to refresh our developer console. Let's refresh our developer console, and now let's search for our file that's called my first Apex. So you see the my first Apex class is available here, and you see this is the same class that we created from VSCode, right? So this is how you can deploy metadata from your source repo, which would be on the VSCode side of it, to your destination orgs. Right now, what org is this? This is the same org that's connected to the VS Code through the default access authorization here. All right, super cool. Let's take a look at retrieving metadata from the org. Now that we have successfully been able to deploy our code from VS Code to the Salesforce org, we might not be doing that all the time. Sometimes it might be the scenario that you might be making changes on your org and then coming down to VS Code and fetching those new changes. So now if let's say I make a change, let's say hello from Salesforce org to VS Code. Let's say this is the change I made. So if you see, this is the latest version that I have of my Apex class, and this is the older version. Now to fetch my information from Salesforce org to my VS Code, what I can do is I can say right click, and instead of deploy, I can use the retrieve command. What does this do? Retrieve the source from org. Like the name suggests, it will fetch the latest source from the org for this particular file. Another way to go about it is click on the click on the file on the classes section and say retrieve source from org. Now when I do that, it says retrieve, and if you see, the message will change now. Hello for VS Code becomes hello from SF org to VS Code. Now this is my latest file. I have my synced file from the Salesforce org, and now my code matches exactly. So this is the deploy and retrieve game that you can play around, and you have to basically do when you are doing Salesforce development. Any kind of metadata that you change on the org has to be retrieved into VS Code. Any kind of change in the metadata on VS Code has to be deployed to your Salesforce org, right? That's how you'd stay on sync. Another important thing on retrieval is something I want to present is what we did here right now was we created a file on VS Code and we deployed it to Salesforce, and then we made an update there and fetched that information here. What if I were to do something like this? What if I were to create a new Apex class on my developer console? Let me call it my second Apex. All right, now I have an Apex class created on the developer console. Now what is my way, or how do I basically fetch that Apex class here? So if I click on classes and I say retrieve source from org, let's see what happens. So if you see that the retrieve has successfully run, but I still see only one Apex class right here. That's my first Apex class, right? So for any kind of new changes that you do to your org, please listen to this carefully. For any kind of new changes that you do to your org and you want to fetch those new changes on your VS Code, you have to use something that's called the org browser right here. The Salesforce icon, the cloud icon that you see here on the extreme left is the Salesforce org browser. Now when I click on it, you'll see that based on the org, it will fetch all the metadata that's present there. So this is an add-on benefit you get with VS Code. So everything that's present as the metadata in your org can be browsed here. Basically, that's why it's called the org browser metadata. And if you see here, this is the personal org, and everything that's present is mentioned here. Now what did we create? We created an Apex class, right? So let's search for Apex somewhere. There should be one specific metadata. So if I see, I have something that's called Apex classes. Now I can either go ahead and click on this download icon, and this will retrieve my entire Apex classes from the org to my local repo. But if I want to specifically download a specific Apex class and retrieve that in my VS Code, I can click on this caret icon. This opens the drop down of the Apex classes, and down here what I can do is I can just fetch my second Apex class, which is listed here. So you have two options, right? So if you want to override all your files and bring them to your local repo, you can do that by clicking the retrieve icon on the top level on the metadata name, or you can also reach it out by file, and just like my second Apex, you can just click on the retrieve icon here, and what this will do is this will fetch you your Apex class. And now if you see, if I go to my file explorer one more time, I see two Apex classes, my first Apex and my second Apex, right? So this is another use case wherein you'll probably you'll be creating custom fields on your Salesforce org. And how do you retrieve them? So you come to your org browser, you go to custom objects. You would have something that's called custom objects probably. So let's see, you would have something that's called custom objects. So let's say you created a field for account, you'll probably have to fetch account from here. or if you want to override your entire object metadata, you can just click on the download icon here. That will retrieve. So if you see this account right here, and when you open account, you can specifically pick and choose what you want to retrieve. And if you retrieve anything from the org browser, that overrides everything that you have on your explorer, right? So if you see, you can basically fetch the entire object metadata through this. All right, so that was retrieving a new file that you create on the Salesforce org. So deploying is fine. Retrieving might be tricky because there are two scenarios. Either you are retrieving something that's already present on VSCode on your Explorer, or you are fetching something that's entirely new, brand new. So you'll have to use the org browser metadata. Make sense? Super cool. All right, lastly, now let's talk about extensions and the 6 must-have extensions for any Salesforce developer. So I have this list right here that states out 7 extensions, but yeah, the one is a bonus. So the first one is Prettier. That's a code formatter extension. So if I take you to the extensions page, you should see something that's called Prettier right here. So this is used for code formatting, and if you see down below, and anytime you open a file, you'll see the Prettier coming down here, and it will show you warning signs or whether your current code has been properly formatted or not. The second one is GitLens. GitLens is specifically used for your VS Code to be integrated with Git, that is your version control system. And once you install Git, you should see the source control icon coming up here, and you can initialize any repository, and you can also connect with GitHub. So once you start using GitLens, you should be able to see who made the current changes, what commit, what was the line on, which PR is this particular commit sustaining to, or connected with. And you can also check your branches, you can create new branches, and everything in and out of Git can be controlled through the SFDX terminal or using just simple commands and this source control dialog box right here, right? The next one is Better Comments. So Better Comments is, as the name suggests, Better Comments lets you improve your code commenting. You can write good annotations, you can write to-dos, and everything is mentioned here. And you can also configure based on what your business or your organization requires. You can accordingly annotate your alerts, you can annotate your informational tags, or you can also mention what kind of comments you want to put in for your methods or your Apex classes, top level, inline level, right? That's about Better Comments. The next one is an interesting one, that's Bracket Pair Colorizer. Now this one is not installed on my system yet, but this is very helpful and very useful. So what this does is, whenever you click on a bracket, it highlights, or it colorizes the brackets so that you can easily identify them. When we write good chunk of code, and there's the code is in code is not some lines of code, but a good chunk of lines. In that case, these brackets come in handy. You don't have to use the caret sign. You can simply click on the bracket and see what color is the matching color down below, and automatically understand, okay, this is where the bracket closes, right? That's about the bracket pair colorizer. And then you have something that's called auto rename tags. So this helps you when you are building lightning components or you are using HTML. So auto rename tag is something that helps you automatically complete your tags and rename them correctly based on where you are currently positioned at, right? So if I were to go to any Aura class, let's say, and if I were to just type in something right here, if I just say dev, so you see this is automatically completing and giving me the right dev command here. So this comes in handy in such scenarios. The next one is Code Spell Checker, which, as the name suggests, helps you spell check your code and shows you warning signs wherever you have a typo. And the last one is Salesforce package XML generator for VS Code. So this is used for generating a sample XML. Remember how we talked about the manifest folder and the XML package XML file? To generate a sample, you can use this particular extension that's available. So if I just type package XML, so I should see this coming up. Let me see what the correct name is. Salesforce package XML generator. Salesforce package XML generator, this right here. So you can use this to generate sample XML files, and the entire process is written here, and you can actually pick and choose what you want to put in your file, and all the commands are available here so that you can configure your custom package.xml and use it for deployments. Yeah, so those are the 6, or rather 7 6+1 extensions that you must have alongside the Salesforce extension pack, which is a must for VS Code to be Salesforce ready. So use this plugins and these extensions, and there are a lot more extensions that are available out there. Whatever works for you is something that is a must have basically. So if you see something like Salesforce snippets is a good plugin to have, wherein you can initialize lists and maps just by writing a small keyword probably. So just take a look at this extension section and see what works for you, and with time you'll become quite dependent on the plugins, but yeah, they are very handy and are very useful for custom development. Alright, that kind of brings me to the end of the course, and before concluding this course, I also wanted to share the shortcut cheat sheet for Windows and Mac OS. So I've attached 2 different resources which are external links, which are downloadable resources, and you can just take a look at the shortcuts. I have often been using Command Shift P and Control P and all of that. So all the shortcuts will be present on your cheat sheet, and you can leverage them and find what works for you. And lastly, I would like to thank you for enrolling to this course, the short and simple course about VS Code, using it to leverage any kind of Salesforce development that you do. And I encourage you to go ahead and start working on custom development and use VS Code to its complete extent. It's an amazing IDE that you can use, and it's here to stay. So go ahead, write some code and get familiar with VS Code, and let me know how it turns out. Thank you everyone. And one last thing before I sign off, I do have other courses which are related to interview questions and admin trainings. So if you're interested in taking a look at those other courses as well, do take a look at them. You should find them under my instructor profile, and yeah, all the best.